Kate Millifalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Um, Happy Women's History Month. I have another famous woman to talk about, and I chose her largely by virtue of her first name. I'm going to talk about Helen Keller. I thought I knew about her. I was surprised. I read about her when I was little. I got a book on famous people, and she was one of the people. There was a lot they didn't talk about in the children's book. This is a very interesting life. And I was contemplating Helen Keller when I was writing this. We complain so much about annoyances. Oh, my knee hurts, or I have a headache, or I'm getting really nearsighted. I say that a lot. I'm getting so much more nearsighted. And then you read about the accomplishments that this woman made, despite the obstacles put in her path, and it blows one's mind. So let's talk about Helen Keller. So she was born June 27th, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Tuscumbia, well, whatever, someplace in Alabama. And 1880, only 15 years after the end of the Civil War, right in the middle of all the stuff that was going on there with Andrew Johnson, and then Grant. So it was a tumultuous period of time. And the South was in real dire straits as far as infrastructure, financially. A lot of men were in bad shape because of the war. So give it a little bit of context of what she came from, but her family was really interesting. Her father, Arthur, who was born in 1836, he died when he was 60. He died 16 years after she was born. Her mother, who was 20 years younger, she was his second wife, died in 1921 when she was 65. So they lived, and Helen Keller was born in living in her grandfather, her great-grandfather, her paternal grandfather's homestead. So he had built this place. It was called Ivy Green. But then when you read on a little bit more, you find out, well, it was slightly more than a homestead. It was a plantation of sorts. Her family was, they were Confederate, and they were enslavers. She had two full siblings, a brother and a sister from her own mother and her father. She had two older brothers who were half brothers from her father's first marriage, James and William. So there was Mildred and Philip, James and Williams, and Helen. Her father was the editor of the local paper, but he had been a captain in the Confederate Army. They were enslavers. They were elite. They were kind of maybe not quite as wealthy as Scarlett O'Hara's family, but they were the elite pre-war. And they lost almost everything after the war. Her maternal grandfather was Charles Adams, who I guess was a well-known Confederate general. Now that's something I had no idea. I do not associate Helen Keller with any of that. And there's more. Her family was originally from Switzerland, and talk about synchronicity. There are no coincidences. One of her ancestors was the first teacher for the deaf in Zurich, Switzerland. She said, no king who has not had a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his. In other words, there is no slave who has not had a king amongst his ancestors. You just don't know who your background is. Nobody is a class. Nobody is a class. You're not born. Your soul is not born in nobility or enslaved or whatever. That's your body's situation. At 19 months, she got sick. Now, there's a lot of speculation what happened to her. They talk about a virus. They talk about a bacterial infection. She had something that caused meningitis, which is an infection of the lining of the brain. And she became blind and deaf. And she talked about it later. She said it felt like she was at sea in a dense fog. I didn't read anywhere whether she remembered sight and sound. Hard to say. She was very young. So she developed her own form of sign language with the daughter of the housekeeper cook that they had. And she could tell the difference between people by the vibration their feet made on the ground. In 1886, her mother read the book American Notes by Charles Dickens. In the book, she read a story of a woman named Laura Bridgman who was deaf and blind and who was successfully educated. Because keep in mind, in this time, if you were deaf and blind, you were written off for sure. So she sent Helen and with her father to Baltimore to see a doctor named Julian Chisholm. And he was a specialist in I guess, deafness or blindness or both, didn't say. And he sent her to see Alexander Graham Bell. Yeah, that guy. He worked with deaf children. So he recommended a place called Perkins Institute for the Blind, that she should go there. The school, they went there to consult with them, and the school recommended that they hire one of their graduates, a new graduate named Anne Sullivan. She was 20. She was almost blind, not completely blind, but visually impaired. She had just graduated from the school. And her story is she was abandoned at a poorhouse as an infant. And she became Helen's tutor and was her tutor and companion. She started out as sort of her governor's tutor, and then as Helen became an adult, her companion for 50 years. She arrived March 5th, 1887. So here we are at March, and Helen referred to this day as my soul's birthday. At first, Keller did not understand that what Anne was doing in her hands was spelling the names of objects. She just didn't get it. She said, I was simply making my fingers do her monkey-like imitation. She was just copying. She had no idea what it meant. But after about a month, one day, there's that famous scene from The Miracle Worker where Anne poured water on her and spelled the word water at the same time, and the light bulb went on over her head. She said, suddenly the mystery of language was revealed. The living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, set it free. So in May of 1888, she went back to Perkins. This would have made her 8 years old. When was she born? Yeah, only 8 years old. She and Anne stayed with her. And she stayed there till 1893 with Anne. And then she went to the William Wade House and Finishing School. So like Eleanor Roosevelt, she was finished. In 1894, both went off to what's called Wright Humason School for the Deaf. At this point, she's 14. Then she went to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf. And in 1896, she went to the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, and in 1900, Radcliffe's College at Harvard. She met Mark Twain at some point. I didn't really find an explanation of how that happened, but he admired her very much. And he introduced her to a guy called Henry R. Rogers, who was a, filthy rich Standard Oil magnate. And Rogers paid for her education. He was so impressed by her. In 1904, when she was 24, she graduated from Radcliffe, Phi Beta Kappa. She was the first deaf-blind person ever to earn a bachelor's degree. She corresponded with a guy called Wilhelm Jerusalem from Austria, who was a philosopher and who discovered her writing talent and encouraged her. She learned to speak, which made a big difference because then she was able to reach more people. She gave speeches all of her life. She did lectures and speeches all over the world. She learned a thing called the Tadoma method. This is where somebody who can't lip read because they're blind and can't hear because they're deaf put their hands on the throat of the speaker, and if you put your hand there and feel the vibrations when you talk, they learn, and I don't know how because it sure doesn't feel different to me, but they learn how to feel the vibration and in that way hear how others speak. She also learned Braille, and she learned that technique called finger spelling. And I do believe that that's different a bit from American Sign Language because that wouldn't have done her any good because she couldn't see. Finger spelling is you actually spell out everything, the letters, and the other person feels it in the palm of your hand. And there are some videos you can watch her doing it, and it's crazy fast. It's just incredible. So Sullivan stayed with her even after she graduated, stayed with her as a friend and a companion. Sullivan got married in 1905 to John Macy, and Anne lived with them. But eventually Sullivan got sick. Her health was failing in 1914. Now, Polly Thompson was a Scottish woman who was hired on. She had really no experience, but she was hired on as secretary and became Anne's companion as Anne Sullivan, Helen's companion as Anne Sullivan. Her health declined. Keller lived with Anne and Macy in Queens, and while she was there, she started the American Foundation for the Blind. So she's starting a whole national, international foundation. I mean, I can barely remember to bring the newspaper in the morning. It's just really astounding to me what she accomplished. In her 30s, she had an affair and was secretly engaged to a guy. His name was Peter Fagan. He was referred to later as the finger spelling socialist. They defied everybody by attempting to elope. Apparently it didn't work out. I couldn't find details. He was a reporter for the Boston Herald, and he was sent to her house to be secretary when Anne got ill. But they had to bring in this other woman because Anne and, not Anne, I'm going to do this the whole time. Helen and Peter developed a fondness for each other. Whatever happened, it didn't work out. And her father had died. Sullivan was gone. Anne Sullivan was gone. She was sick. So Keller moved to Alabama with her mother, I think Montgomery, Alabama, if I remember correctly. In 1936, Anne Sullivan died. And Polly moved in with Helen. They actually moved in together in a place in Connecticut. She then began a series of lectures and raising money for the blind. She traveled all over the world raising money for the blind. Now, there's a whole lot more to her life, but just to tie up loose ends here, in 1957, Polly had a stroke, and in 1960, she died. But she had a nurse who came in and took care of her. Anne was there. Helen was there. Sorry about that. I'm confusing everybody. Now you all know what it feels like to be me. Helen was there, and Polly, was the patient now, and they brought in a nurse to take care of Polly. The nurse's name was Winnie Corbally, and after Polly died, she stayed with Helen until Helen died. Helen was fond of Akitas, the dog, and she traveled to Japan to learn more about them, and she introduced them to the United States. She brought back the first Akita to the United States. And the first one she brought back died in 2 months of some kind of an infection. And she got his brother, his actual biological brother. I have to tell you a little something about Akitas. They're formidable looking dogs. First of all, they're huge. They bond with one person. They're guard dogs. They were genetically raised to be as fierce and protective as possible because they guarded the Emperor of Japan. My neighbor across the street that I took care of for a number of years before she died, I was her Polly. I stayed and took care of her, and we developed a very close relationship. She had a son who lived locally, and he had 2 Akitas. And he used to bring one over when he visited her, and that dog was terrifying. Now, I have dogs. I'm not afraid of dogs. I've never had a bad experience with a dog. This dog was terrifying. And my husband has always had dogs, even longer than I have. And he's into dogs. He's very good with them. And he came over one day, and we had the key. We let ourselves in and out. And he didn't know that her son was there. He knew I was there. And, my neighbor was there, but her son was visiting, and I had brought his dog. And this dog never sat down. When he was in her house, he patrolled the perimeter of the house. He went into every room and went around the perimeter and came out and went down the hall and went to the next room. And it was nerve-wracking because he was his demeanor, he didn't make friends with you. So my husband came to the back door and put the key in the lock and started to unlock the door, and the dog went for him. Fortunately, the door was still shut. My husband just about had a second heart attack. It was dramatic. And sad to say, the son kept 2 of these dogs and had to build 2 fences, like 2 layers of fences, because he was so concerned about these dogs. They got out and killed a neighbor's goats, and they had to put the dogs down. So my advice would be, an Akita is not a lap dog, but I could see why somebody who really needs to bond one-on-one with a protective dog would find that breed to be really useful, and I could see why the dog would choose that person and really become their protector. The dog would inherently know that person needed protection. Doesn't surprise me. So Keller replaced her eyes eventually with glass eyes for cosmetic reasons because of the infection that she had. She had kind of a form of exophthalmia, when you're, Cash Patel. Your eyes are just, so they replaced them just for cosmetic reasons. She wrote and spoke about social issues and economic injustice, the corruption of the rich, human rights, service to others. She's a very philosophical person. She advocated for the disabled. She was a suffragist. She was a pacifist. She was a Christian socialist. And she was pro-birth control before that was a popular opinion. She strongly opposed Woodrow Wilson, and I would recommend the book I did a while back called The Presidents and the People by Corey Brett Schneider, 5 presidents who tried to destroy democracy, and Woodrow Wilson was one of them. In 1915, she founded the Helen Keller International it's called Helen Keller Institute to research vision, health, and nutrition. They did scientific studies. In 1916, she gave money to the NAACP. She felt particularly personally embarrassed, ashamed to be from the South and from her family who were Confederates and enslavers. She was horrified by the unchristian treatment of African Americans in the South. In 1920, she helped found the American Civil Liberties Union. You might have heard of them. She traveled from over more than 40 countries. She is especially beloved in Japan. She met every single president from Cleveland to LBJ. She was good friends with Mark Twain, close friends with Mark Twain. She knew Alexander Graham Bell well. She and Twain were kind of lumped together. They were called political radicals and leftists. And she liked to talk about the poor being ground down by industrial oppression. She admitted that she had been born into advantage. She said the power to rise is not within the reach of everybody. You like to rise above your station, to get out of a hard situation. In 1909, she joined the Socialist Party of America. She fought for the working class. She was really into unions. She opposed military interventionism. She got speech therapy to be able to do public speaking and be more clear for the general public. She fought aggressively to put forward her articles. The Rockefeller-owned press refused to print them until she finally wore them down and they began printing her articles. She was a big supporter of Eugene Debs. I have got to do a video about him. I find him fascinating. She expressed socialist views and remarked that newspapers who once praised her courage and her intelligence after her socialist views became known began to just point out her disabilities. In 1912, she joined the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies. She advocated from a concern for the blindness that was caused. Now, this is really interesting. At first, she only called it industrial conditions. But then she started speaking, doing a speaking tour about it, and she got very specific. It made a lot of people really uncomfortable. And there was a huge element of truth to this. So there's a subset of people whose blindness, she said, was caused by industrial poverty. She pointed out the long hours, the lack of money, the desperation of people who had no safety net. Women would go into sex work. Inevitably, because there were no antibiotics that early on, they would end up with sexually transmitted diseases, especially syphilis, and it caused blindness in babies and in the adults, but in babies. And so she spoke openly, constantly about this. She was on the FBI watch list, even up through the McCarthy era into the 50s. So as I always like to say, nobody is perfect. No one amongst us is perfect. She was a eugenicist. This is kind of interesting to see what her motivation was. She didn't believe in life-saving measures for newborns that obviously had issues. She said her rationale was they would become criminals. So I don't know, I don't know about that. But she fought overpopulation. She wrote 12 books, including her 1903 book, The Story of My Life. In 1907, she started to advocate the washing of newborns' eyes with disinfectants immediately after birth to prevent certain kinds of blindness. And it turns out that's actually true. Nowadays, they put antibiotics in newborns' eyes. If you've been around a newborn, you'll notice that they're trying to see through the film of the antibiotic. It became adopted as a common public health measure because of the advocacy of Helen Keller. She became a Christian, and in 1927, she wrote a book called My Religion. It was her spiritual autobiography. She was really into Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a theologian and a mystic. He was a Christian theologian, but he was a little bit more esoteric than was normally heard at the time. Her archives of work were held at the American Foundation for the Blind, and some of them were lost on 9/11. That seems really tragic. In 1961, she experienced a series of strokes. In 64, Johnson, LBJ, gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 65, she was put inside the National Women's Hall of Fame. I think it was for the World's Fair, but it's now permanent. And June 1st, 1968, she died at the age of 87. Her services were held at the Washington National Cathedral, and her ashes were buried there next to the ashes of Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson. She wrote a ton of stuff. I'm not even going to go into it. And there's all kinds of media representation of her documentaries and movies and plays. And it's just, you know, she was very, very popular. I pulled a couple out because I thought they were interesting. In 1919, she and Anne Sullivan made a silent documentary, sort of. It was like an allegory of her life, but Helen and Anne were in it, of a silent film of her life story. In 1954, a documentary was made called Helen Keller, Her Story. And then, of course, there's The Miracle Worker, which was actually a conglomeration of stories, most of them taken from her autobiography. And the title was taken from Mark Twain, her good friend. So I just thought that we should acknowledge Helen Keller. She is one of those names that's heard so much you don't hear it anymore. You know, it just sort of goes over your head. And I hadn't thought of her in a very, very long time. And I guess I knew about the ACLU, but I'd forgotten. When I read it the other day, I was like, oh yeah, God, I'd completely forgotten. We need to be reminded about the good works that she did and about her strength of character, because overcoming the obstacles in her path, she did more than most of us with all 5 and sometimes 6 senses. So that's the story of Helen Keller. Happy Women's History Month. And thank you for watching Slongafoil. Sloncha.